The topic of this event today is using the diary method to study workplace conflict among academics in a complex context. And in today's discussion, I'll be focusing on the design, challenges, and some insights that I gained from doing the diary component of the study. So let me start going over the plan for today's session. I'll start introducing some background information about the research topic and the context in which this study was conducted, which is Syrian higher education institutions. Then we'll move to an interactive part where we'll have a group discussion. And I'd be really interested in hearing your ideas about how you would design this or a similar diary study, given the topic of the research and the context, which I will describe in a minute. Afterwards, I'll move to describe the actual diary design that I conducted and the decisions I made and the reasons behind those decisions. Then I'll go over the methodological contribution of the diary component of my study. And of course, there'll be a discussion of the challenges I faced in doing this study and the lessons I learned. And we'll end with some question and answer and a discussion, some insights, recommendations for the future, anything you can think of and would like to share with all of us. So to start, the session today is based on my PhD study, and I will start with a discussion of the focus of the research and the methodological orientation. So as I mentioned before, the research focus is workplace conflict among academics in Syrian higher education institutions. And this included looking at how conflict emerges and develops, how it is responded to by the people involved in the conflict, and what roles heads of departments play in conflict and also in conflict management. My slides decided not to move. So for data, I have used two methods. The first of which is semi-structured interviews and solicited semi-structured diaries. And this combination provided me with both retrospective accounts and more temporarily situated reflections. As for the analytical stance, so I adopted a qualitative methodology, and it is a discourse-oriented study informed by Foucauldian thinking. I have employed a toolkit of Foucauldian concepts that enabled me to look at issues of power, discursive constructions, and subjectivity, and the institutional norms, all of which form the basis on which conflict emerges, develops, and is managed or otherwise. Now, let's talk a little bit about the topic. As I mentioned, it's workplace conflict among academics in Syrian higher education institutions, and to give some information about the context in which this study was conducted. So the Syrian context is characterized by a protracted national conflict. I started data collection in 2023, and at that time, the conflict had been underway for almost 12 years. And this, of course, shaped everything, all aspects of life, including institutional life, how people relate to each other. It has led to institutional disruption, very difficult resource problems with resources, problems with transportation, for example, people couldn't go to work, displacement, and other issues. It has also the conflict has resulted in economic crisis and very pressing financial circumstances. The vast majority of people in the country live below the poverty line. Most people have to do 2 or more jobs to be able to manage. and academics are not an exception to that. And in fact, in a study or in a report that came last year, I think, shows that Syrian academics have the lowest salaries worldwide, and with a big gap between them and the second worst salaries. So it was a really difficult conditions that people are living in. The conflict has also resulted in damaged infrastructure, and of special relevance to the study today is the availability of electricity and internet connection. And there's a major difficulty which is related to censorship and culture of fear, where people constantly feel that they are watched. Everything they say or do might be used against them. They don't feel free to express themselves the way they want. And this culture of fear has also created a sense of self-censorship, where people would not share what they are really thinking, and this reflects on participation in research. So the topic itself, conflict as a topic, is a sensitive one, and it is relational. And this is especially important when we're talking about the group of participants in my study who are academics. And academics everywhere live under very strong notions of collegiality and professionalism, which makes it very difficult for them to talk about conflict or even admit that exists. And this means that it happens in very subtle ways, and this makes it difficult to capture. Conflict often also includes informal micro-interactions, and these are things that can be easily forgotten in an interview encounter, for example, or they get normalized and taken for granted, so they might not be captured easily. So the question I had to answer when designing this study is, how can a study capture conflict as it unfolds, while also respecting the participants' context, their difficult circumstances, their concerns about safety, for example, how much time they can put into participation in a study, and other issues related to participation. And now I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on how to address these issues. So we can have a discussion, an interactive part of this session. And the question is, how would you design this diary study? So imagine you are studying workplace conflict among academics in a context where the topic is sensitive, access is difficult, participants might have concerns about visibility, time, safety, and other practical concerns. I'd like you to think about the format that you would use if you were to design a study like this. So would you choose to have a written diary, an audio, visual? Would you use an online form, for example? So the format, the frequency, how often would you ask the participants to send an entry? The duration, how long would the diary study be? Is it a month, a year, a week? How long would you think is suitable? And the structure, would you use a structured diary, a semi-structured one, and unstructured? Would you use prompts or leave it open? Would you use close-ended questions, for example, yes, no questions or multiple choice, so on and so forth. So I give you a minute or two to think about these prompts, and then we'll move to a whole group discussion. So what I actually used was a semi-structured and written diaries. And the purpose of that was to enhance the sense of control for the participants. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Participants responded to guiding prompts enough to provide enough structure for relevance, while also preserving space for participants to decide what mattered to them and what they thought of as conflict and how they wanted to frame it.
Fatima, you've suddenly gone
You're
on
on
mute.
mute. You're on mute.
Sorry. So the frequency was fortnightly, every 2 weeks, and for the duration of 2 months. 4 months, sorry. And the reason behind that is that I wanted it not to be too demanding, but also close enough to the occurrence of the conflict in order not to miss details. And another reason that I didn't choose to make it more frequent is that the majority of academics in Syria do not go to the university every day. And when they are working from home, they're not online, which means they will probably not have a lot of interaction with others. So I thought it might not be necessary to have a more frequent diary. And the reason behind the duration that I chose is that it covers an academic term to account for various types of interactions and causes of conflict. For example, at the beginning of the term, we have issues relating to workload allocation, module allocation, timetabling, classroom allocation, things like that. While at the end of the term, we have issues related to exams, invigilation, exam writing, evaluation and assessment criteria. And these different things will shape the interactions and the causes of conflict. So why written and why asynchronous? Participants could complete entries in their own time rather than in a live live encounter with the researcher. And I really wanted it to be as convenient for them to do as possible given their difficult circumstances. So they could write the entry wherever they were, whenever they wanted, maybe late at night, over a weekend, so on and so forth. The written format reduced dependence on stable internet access and synchronous availability, so they could write the entry and then send it when it was possible for them. It gave participants greater control over what to disclose, how to phrase it, and when to send it. And this was a very big concern for me because knowing the sensitivity of the topic itself, I was careful to choose a format that allowed participants some time to reflect and be able to choose what they wanted to say and how they wanted to phrase it. So they might decide to phrase things in implicit ways that do not land in a different way from what is intended if they send a voice note, for example. So giving them this time to think and reflect before saying what they wanted to say. Of course, this flexibility also meant that entries were reflective, selective, and shaped by self-presentation. And this was important analytically, and it was in alignment with the theoretical approach that I chose. So in general, the diary was not designed to capture raw or an unmediated reality, as in voice notes, for example, or audio diaries. It was rather designed to create a temporal, reflective account of conflict as participants made sense of it over time. So I was interested in how they constructed conflict and their experiences of it. Now, it's important to think about how the diary and the interviews complemented each other. As I said before, the interviews were conducted first and then the diaries. The interviews allowed for a fuller narrative accounts with retrospective accounts of the constructions of conflict, overall experiences of conflict. The interviews allowed for contextual explanation, retrospective meaning making, and opportunity for probing, which is very important. While on the other hand, the diaries were more or provided more temporary distributed accounts. They accounted for the everyday micro interactions of conflict. They captured changes and reframings over time, and this is really important. And they had a participant-led emphasis. So together, the diaries and the interviews provided a richer account of conflict as remembered, narrated, and experienced. So what diaries made possible in this study? First, the diary made it possible to capture conflict as a process, not as a one-time occurrence that participants remember, tell, and that's it. So they supported attention to how conflict developed, lingered, de-escalated or escalated or even stagnated, and how it was repeatedly reinterpreted over time. As I said before, the diaries accounted for the everyday micro interactions. They enabled participants to recall smaller incidents, informal exchanges, and repeated tensions that may not be captured in an interview mode. They might be forgotten or even taken for granted and memorized. Participant control is an important one. I aim to balance the power dynamics between the participant and the researcher, and also control in the sense that the written format allows participants to decide what to disclose and how to narrate sensitive experiences such as conflict. Analytically, the diaries added a temporal layer to discourse analysis by showing how framings of conflict shifted over time. And I could see in the data, for example, in one entry, the participant would relate to conflict as an experience in which they cannot relate to a colleague. They do not want to interact with them. While in the next diary, they showed that conflict was a situation in which they allowed themselves to negotiate with a colleague, to have difficult conversations, and even to show sympathy towards that colleague. So the diary did not simply give a bigger, or the aim of using the diary was not to get more data, but it was to produce a different temporal and reflective form of data. Now, of course, with these provisions that the diary allows for, there are challenges, and probably one of the well-known ones is recruitment. There was a lot of resistance to participating in the study in general, but particularly in the diary component. And I think one of the reasons is that keeping diary is not a common practice in Syria. And I was actually, when I approached participants, I was careful not to use the word diary because in Arabic it translates into yawmiyat, which indicates a daily participation, which I thought might be received as intrusive and too much. But still there was resistance to participation. And of course, attrition, some people participated at the beginning and then they said, oh, nothing is happening, I want to stop submitting the diary entries. Something that I initially viewed as a challenge was the variable richness of the diary data. Some people provided detailed accounts and descriptions of their experiences with conflict, along with their reflections and how they felt about it, while some other people just said, oh, nothing happened, or I had a conflict with colleague over this and that in just a few words. But of course, later I learned that this itself is information as well. A challenge that might be related to me, it's just a me thing, is rapport building and communication without being intrusive. Because in the back of my head, I always had this concern that these academics have very difficult circumstances and I don't want to be intrusive. But at the same time, it's well known that for the diary data, it's important to keep communication going, to show appreciation, to send reminders, to say thank you after every entry. So finding the balance between the two was not an easy thing. The lessons I learned is that less frequent entries and fewer diaries can still be analytically valuable. There was a time when I wanted to ditch the diary component from the study, but I'm glad that I listened to my supervisor's advice and persevered with it because it provided very rich and different kind of data than the interviews. So the diaries definitely require ongoing relationship management and finding the right balance between communication and between not being too intrusive too much. And of course, flexibility and responsiveness are necessary, particularly in challenging contexts. And one example for that happened in my study is that I started thinking I wanted to use a form using Qualtrics, but then that didn't work with the participants because of the sanctions on the country. Not all participants could find their way around and use the form. So I had to switch to Word documents that were shared via WhatsApp, which meant I needed to go back to the ethical process again. So that flexibility was actually needed in this context. And then one final question that remains with me is what counts as enough diary data? I'm not sure there is an answer to this question, but this is something we can discuss in the remaining few minutes. So thank you so much